Welcome to the OK Book Club, where we dive into books, stories, people, and tons of different topics. Today, we're going to take a look at another Aesop's Fable. This one is not about a fox. I think I've had enough of the fox. This one is called The Gnat and the Bull. And I'll say this up front, friends, children and adults. What's interesting, if you look at this word, you wonder why kids have such a hard time figuring out how to read. Gnat is spelled G-N-A-T. Of course, that makes complete sense. Throw a G in there. Gnat, right? I challenge any person that's coming up and starting to read, and that's how they're going to pronounce it, of course. But as we know, and this will be interesting because I will do future lessons on phonics, the challenge that young children have with reading. There's so many places we can go there, but certainly one of them is that silent letter, where you will have not only GN is very rare. You'll have sign. GN will go at the end of the word. Or those funny little men that hang out in gardens, the gnomes, right? But for the most part, you'll see more often KN as in knife, right? Or you'll see WR as in wrist. So you'll have the W as being silent, the K as being silent. And those are very common when we're learning to read. But nevertheless, let's get on to talk about the gnat and the bull. I really have had a great time analyzing and looking into all these different Aesop's fables. And one thing I want to point out right from the beginning, as I mentioned, I have three resources here. The Scholastic version that was written in the early 1960s, the Aesop's Fables version from Barnes & Noble that everyone can buy throughout the country. And then what's accessible online is the Library of Congress's version. And what I found is that there's not that many that are common in all the different versions and publications of Aesop's Fables. I just went through four. I went through actually 4 or 5 trying to find one that I would put here on the podcast, and one would be in one version, and I couldn't find it in another version. Now, granted, there's lots of familiar ones that we all know: The Tortoise and the Hare, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, The Lion and the Mouse, The Fox and the Grapes. I wanted purposely to pick a fable that a lot of you have not probably heard. And certainly when I've read these, they're just as interesting as the ones we all know. And one more point, this is especially for the children. Children, it's important for you to understand that a lot of what you read is not the same way that you will hear other people speaking, or it's not the same way that you will speak. So you can pick out pretty much any sentence from any story you read and just think to yourself, why is that difficult to understand or read? Because you wouldn't say that out loud. Spoken language is different than written language. So if you're ever wondering why it's hard to figure out what someone has written, that's why. And you'll see this as a perfect example in this particular Aesop's fable. And children, if you ever say to yourself, how come I can't figure this out when mommy and daddy can, or your older brother or sister? It's very simple. It's just that we have read some of these expressions, some of these complex ways they put words into sentences. We've seen them before. And we were at the same spot you were, and we're all the same. So never any worries. So let's take a look at the gnat and the bull. I'm reading from the Library of Congress's version. A gnat flew over the meadow with such buzzing for so small a creature and settled on the tip of one of the horns of a bull. After he had rested a short time, he made ready to fly away. But before he left, he begged the bull's pardon for having used his horn for a resting place. "You must be very glad to have me go now," he said. It's all the same to me," replied the bull. "I did not even know you were there." So friends, stop right now. Think about what you believe the moral of the story is, the message that the story conveys. What is it that you can take from this story and apply it to your life? I challenge you, adults, parents, not easy. Okay, so to start off, before I give you my take on this, parents, again, it's very, very important when you read these stories out loud to your children that you make sure that you read it first so that before you read it all the way through, your children know some complex vocabulary words. And listen, don't take for granted really anything. A gnat, for example. Children, a gnat is basically a little tiny bug that's it has a reputation for being annoying. And if you've ever seen a bull or a cow out in a pasture, there's gnats all over the place. And if you've ever been outside in a humid summer day, children, and little tiny flies you can hardly even see are not necessarily making loud noises like bees, but they just fly around in your face and you just have to swat them away. Those are gnats. And the one line in here about the gnat after he sat on the bull's horn, the line is, "But before he left, he begged the bull's pardon for having used his horn for a resting place." He begged the bull's pardon. I mean, again, going back to complex language and how words are written differently on a page, we would never say that. Children, adults would never say this. So when you beg the bull's pardon, it's another way of saying when you apologize to someone. In this case, the gnat is apologizing to the bull. So my take, and I'll tell you this up front, I disagree with some of the versions of what the morals are that have been handed down through the ages. I think it's, hey, everything is in your point of view. What you see may not be what you see. And if you think you're a burden to others, maybe you're not. Now, when you talk about being a burden and having that be a message of the story, you're going more specifically to what happened to the story. And as much as you can, children, you want to stay away from specifically what happened in the story. When you talk about your morals, you want to use what happened in the story to inform what your message will be, but you want to stay away from actually using specific words. And in this case, it's hard to do, and I hope this makes sense, parents, but in effect, sometimes you can't get away from it. But what I'm saying here is that really the message may not necessarily be worrying about being a burden. In this case, here's what the Library of Congress said the moral is. "We are often of greater importance in our own eyes than in the eyes of our neighbor. The smaller the mind, the greater the conceit." Oh boy, that's talk about big words there. Barnes & Noble says, "Some men are more important in their own eyes than in those of their neighbors." And finally, Scholastic says, "We are not always as important as we think we are." I'm inclined to go with Scholastic. But even their message doesn't necessarily relate to the story. Here was this gnat that basically is asking for just being nice and apologizing. I think a lot of these messages come from the lens of being critical, not being nice, maybe even gloating. If that was the case, then I can see the message being, yeah, I think I'm more important than you. And again, I understand where the message comes from, but I hope that makes sense, friends, that since in the particular story, it wasn't never once did the gnat ever think that it was being more important. Yet I think where the message is coming from is the gnat sincerely believes that he is a burden, or that, yes, he is standing out. Again, and that's why I believe everything is in your point of view. When I've talked about point of view, the best example, children, when you still forget what that means is, what's your point of view? Well, just think of a puddle. If you're coming from the point of view of an ant, that puddle is an ocean. But if you're coming from the point of view of an elephant, that puddle is just a speck of water on a gnat, so to speak, right? So I think this has been a great little Aesop's Fable, and you can always reference this when you think maybe you're more important than you really do think you are. Right? And that reminds me of a story, and you can just tell people to be able to rattle off some of these Aesop's fables in your own life. Their jaw will drop to the floor and their eyes will light up. Wow, look at this. Look at how smart you are. Aesop's Fables, way to go. Okay, you may hear our buddy Jasper in the background right now. He just woke up and he runs downstairs and he just throws his whole body on the carpet, just trying to, I don't know what he's doing. But anyway, he's very rambunctious in the morning and you may hear him. But nevertheless, here's one more point I want to make. And yes, you can hear him in the background playing with his little toys. And I've said this before, but I find this so fascinating when you dive into these Aesop's Fables, like I've told you before. They're different. Now, what's interesting for the most part is they're all short and they all have pretty much the same message that I kind of disagree with. But nevertheless, the setting is different. In the Library of Congress version, it's the bull is out in a meadow. In Barnes and Noble, he's not in a meadow at all. He was driven by the heat. He ends up wading up to his knees in a cool, swift-running stream. And finally, in the Scholastic version, you have no idea where the bull is. It's just really interesting. So a few final points before we wrap up our episode. I've mentioned the Library of Congress. Children, the Library of Congress is actually a physical location in Washington, D.C., where a lot of historical documents are kept, both in paper and online in what they call digital formats. And parents, if you're wanting to get a version of Aesop's Fables, without a doubt, go down to your local Barnes & Noble and it's a pink hardcover, smaller book, and it's just, number one, it's a quality book to hold in your hands. Almost every single fable has a great picture that goes along with it. Why the Scholastic version doesn't have pictures for every story? It is, in this case, it's definitely going to be hard to find. But if you went on Amazon, I'm sure you could type in Apple Classics, Anne McGovern. There's a picture of a fox, the fox trying to get the grapes on the cover, Aesop's Fables. But the final point about the Library of Congress version, you can have this easily on your tablet, and what's fun for the children is each picture that goes along with the story, you can click on the image of the picture, and in this case with the gnat and the bull, you can see the gnat moving from one horn to the other, and the bull is actually looking at the gnat. In this case, as we learned from the story, only after the gnat started talking to the bull. So, if you've listened this long, number one, thank you. Number two, you can go to your nearest podcast platform, the one you're listening to right here. Give me a 5-star review. And if you write a review, that's even better. It helps with getting my podcast out there so more people can listen. Please also email me if you have questions, comments, concerns. Hopefully you don't have any concerns, but you know what I'm saying. Feedback is what I'm after. What you like, what you don't like. KEVMOK21@gmail.com. If you write a review or you reach out to me, with your permission, I'll give you a shout out on a future episode. So this has been the OK Book Club, and keep learning.